Hi there. My name is Celine Coggins. I'm the Executive Director of Grantmakers for Education, and I'm really excited to get to close out this day with a real treat of a conversation. I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Pedro Nogueira, who is the Dean of the Rossier School of Education at USC, and also the author, with Rick Hess, of a recent book called A Search for Common Ground, Conversations about the Toughest Questions in K-12 Education. So Pedro, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Celine.
Right.
Great to be with you.
Yeah, well, I'd love to start out by just talking about some of these tough questions that exist in education. And let's start with where we are right now. So these are uncommon times. There's a lot about the status quo that people would just like to return to. Let's return to normal. But I think you would say there are some things that really need to change. So talk to me about what we should leave behind from the past era and what we should be growing into.
Great question. And let me just start because although Rick and I wrote the book to address the polarization that was already present in education even before the current period, I think for both of us, the opposite of polarization is not simply compromise or quiet. It is reasoned civil debate. It is dialogue. It is listening to each other and examining evidence. And I think that readers who look at our book will find that's what we do. So the goal was not common ground necessarily. The goal was to address these complex issues and to acknowledge the complexity of them. So in response to your question about how, as we're coming out of the pandemic and schools are reopening, I think I, like many others, have hoped that the pandemic, the disruption it created, would serve as an opportunity to begin to do things differently. We know that even before the pandemic, we had these deep and persistent disparities in achievement. We know that lots of kids were alienated and not particularly inspired by school. And we know that there was a rising number of kids with mental health challenges. We can expect the mental health challenges to increase. The evidence is there as a result of the pandemic. And I think really the challenge now is to make schools more responsive, more challenging, more stimulating than they were before. And that's my hope, is that the educators are not just thinking about returning to normal, not just consumed with the logistics of how to do things safely, which is important, but how to make it better than it was. And there's good reason to hope that that'll be the case.
So the money's there. We know there's tons of money flowing into schools. So what are your first few priorities for what we should be doing with it?
Well, I put them in two places. First, I think we've got to come prepared to address those mental health challenges. And so to make sure we have counselors, social workers, and the ability to refer kids who have more severe needs to experts. We know it's coming, and what we need to do is prepare our teachers to become first responders so they can identify kids at risk, but also so that they can do the work of building a sense of community in their classrooms. We know from the research that when kids feel connected to each other, connected to their teachers, they do better, and they're more likely to tell us if there's a problem amiss. So I think that those efforts should be a real priority. The other issue is the learning loss that we know many kids have experienced. And I think the best things that schools could do would be first to assess kids to understand what the needs are, and then to the degree that they can, with these additional resources, get access to tutors and individualized support for more kids. One of the things, if we've learned nothing over the last several years, it's that you can't treat everybody the same. Some kids were thriving during remote learning. Some kids were not. And so we can't assume they've experienced the same loss or will have the same difficulties. So we really need to know what the needs are and then be really thoughtful in how we respond.
So some of those things that you mentioned kind of sit outside the traditional kind of academic classroom. So I'm going to quote you to you for a minute. So you've said, no society in the world expects schools alone to reduce inequality and poverty. So how do we do that? How do we engage other stakeholders? How do we engage other sectors of public life? Give me some ideas.
So, I'll just give you one example in terms of healthcare. We have lots of kids who miss school because they're asthmatic or because they need to see a dentist. They can't read because they need eyeglasses. This is millions of kids in America I'm talking about. This is not a small number. Just unmet health needs impacts learning, impacts attendance, impacts achievement. In many other countries, that's not a school issue. We don't expect nurses at schools to address all those needs. We have a healthcare system that responds to the needs of kids. That's the direction we should be moving in. I want to applaud the Biden administration for the support to families with children, but that's just a step in the right direction because over 50% of the kids in this country come from families in poverty, are on free and reduced lunch. That means that they're looking to school for their meals. Think about what that means. When adequate nutrition is only guaranteed in school, well, what happens on the weekends? What happens in the summer? So we need to think about this as a nation. What are we doing to support our children? What are we doing? The money we invest in children is money that is invested in our future, because these are our future workers, our future professionals, our future parents, our future voters. And so we've got to start thinking about this as a societal investment and not merely as a school reform strategy.
And what about the responsibility of business, philanthropy? How do we get folks like that more involved in making sure schools are doing what they need to do?
So there have been a lot of foundations that have stepped up and helping in early childhood education or the full service schools or after school programs, and that's to be applauded. But charity can never make up for the role of government. It really can't, because I'll just give you an example. Many people have heard of the Harlem Children's Zone. Harlem Children's Zone is the most ambitious, the most comprehensive initiative in the country aimed at addressing the needs of poor children from birth through college. And it works. We have ample evidence, longitudinal evidence, that when you support kids with these comprehensive strategies, it makes a difference, outcomes improve, those gaps in achievement can be eliminated. The Harlem Children's Zone serves 12,000 kids in central Harlem. Just a little north of Harlem is Washington Heights. There's no similar effort there. Or across the river in the South Bronx. So, you can't do this through charitable initiatives alone. We need a more comprehensive strategy. We need to get city government, state government, federal government working together to solve some of this. And as I said, this is not simply an issue for our schools.
Not long ago, we talked about the education system, the public education system in America, as basically K through 12. There is lots of conversation now about universal pre-K, birth through 5. There's lots of talk about free college. How do we manage these competing tensions in the education system we need?
Let's stay focused on the research, and the evidence, what it shows us. A few years ago, I spoke to the National Governors Association. There were probably about 22 governors in the room. And I mentioned then that Oklahoma was the leading state in the nation in providing access to early childhood education. And the governor of Oklahoma was sitting there, and I asked him, why has Oklahoma become the leader? And he said, because we've seen the research, and we know that when we invest in quality early childhood education, and they've done that through a partnership with a large oil company in Oklahoma, that it means more kids will go to college, kids will earn more money, negative outcomes will be reduced. The evidence is compelling. I said in response, well, we need to share that evidence with the other governors because Oklahoma is doing something right. Oklahoma is a conservative red state, but they understand the importance of investing in children. So we should not allow this to become a political issue that divides us. The focus should be on how do we do this for all kids in America.
Appreciate that. So we're here today at the Reagan Institute. You wrote a book with a conservative thinker, Rick Hess. What was the issue that was most divisive? What was the issue where you found the least common ground?
I would say that to some degree, the issue of choice was one that where we were still pretty divided, and it's not because I'm anti-choice. I always point out that affluent people always have choice, including myself. If we don't like the schools our kids are assigned to, we'll put them in private schools. We'll move. We'll do whatever it takes to get our kids a good education. It's low-income families that never have choice. And too often they are forced to send their kids to schools that are subpar, that can't meet their needs. My problem with choice systems is it doesn't solve that problem. It solves it for some, those who are chosen, those who are lucky enough to get their kids into good schools. But as we know, there's not a choice system in the country where all the schools are good choices. Some kids are going to end up in those bad schools. And too often what we see in choice systems is that the inequities are exacerbated. And we've seen this in New York, we've seen it in New Orleans and DC. So the schools that take the largest number of very high need kids, I mean, talking about kids with special needs, English learners, homeless kids, kids in foster care, tend to be the schools that are struggling. And what we know is that when you concentrate large numbers of kids like these into a school, the likelihood that that school will fail goes way up. That is not a strategy for success.
That's helpful. So tell me some of the elements where you did find common ground across the political spectrum.
I think both Rick and I attribute this to the fact that both of us have worked with superintendents around the country. And superintendents tend to be pragmatic people because they've got to figure stuff out. They've got to solve problems in their local districts. And so on many of the questions about, say, for example, assessment, Rick and I both agree assessment is absolutely necessary. We need to know where kids are. But assessment should be used as a tool, not as a means to rank kids, rank teachers, rank schools. Being ranked doesn't help you. What does help you is getting clear information on what this student needs and making sure that we get that information to a well-trained teacher so we can meet the student's needs. And so this was just an example because, again, this is an issue that has divided the country, high stakes testing. We saw a walkout by many parents, many of them affluent, who opted out of testing. And I think the real issue is how we use testing and how we use the information. And that's just an example where I think two people who come at the issues differently came to very similar conclusions.
That makes sense. So you brought up this issue of measurement. Schools and kids' needs have really dramatically changed, and we're in the middle of a debate over how to assess student progress. So how do you think, in say 3 years from now, 5 years from now, when the dust has settled, how do you think we're going to measure school success and student success? How's it going to look different?
My hope is that we're going to see a lot more performance-based assessment. And for those who are not familiar with the concept, what it means is we actually look at the work kids produce. We want to know, can they write? Let's look at their writing. Can they write a research paper? Do they know how to use evidence and support arguments? Can they problem solve? Let's look at the work they produce. And because the standardized tests don't tell us enough. They tell us whether or not kids were prepared for the test, but they don't tell us what they were actually learned and whether or not they were prepared. There are a small number of schools, there are about 38 of them in New York, that have been doing performance-based assessment for several years. And what the evidence shows is their kids come out better prepared for college than kids at traditional schools because they're writing more, they're doing more college-level work while they're in high school. And that's what we should be doing, is raising standards, but making sure that standards are accessible for kids and that we're using assessment to gauge and to monitor what kids are actually doing.
All right. I want to switch to the topic of equity. I want to switch to something where maybe you might be in disagreement with some of our conservative friends here at the Reagan Institute. Give us your take on what's happening with the exploding debate over critical race theory. What's happening? What should we be teaching in schools? And how do we navigate the politics of now?
So this is a good example of a total red herring. I would challenge anyone listening, because I don't know of any single school district in the country that teaches critical race theory. Can you name one?
No,
I can't think of any.
Mm-hmm.
There are a small number of colleges where it's taught, but I don't know any K-12 institutions in the country that teach critical race theory. Now, are there schools that do bias training poorly in ways that would alienate and infuriate some of us? Sure. Are there schools that have made poor choices about what kids should learn and eliminated books? Yes. So, for those who are concerned about the way issues of race and diversity are being handled, I would say look at the state standards, because the state standards are very clear about what should be taught. And all states in America say we should teach kids about the horrors of slavery. So if the goal is to erase discussions of racism from the curriculum, that's a problem, because we all know racism is really deep and systemic and a central part of American history. Many Americans were shocked to learn about the Tulsa race massacre because it wasn't typically taught in our schools. So I think we have to make sure we're not denying kids of a rich education. We also have to make sure that the education is not exacerbating racial tensions, nobody should want that. And it's in fact preparing kids to live in a more diverse society. So, I'd encourage those who are listening to avoid the loud sound bites and to really look at the evidence of what's going on in our schools.
I think that's helpful. So on this topic, of civic engagement, we know that, our democracy in a lot of ways is in peril right now. How do we help students today to get more involved civically?
So part of what Rick and I wanted to do in our book is to demonstrate what it's like to engage in civil debate, to listen to each other, to engage in dialogue, to identify points of agreement, but also areas of principled disagreement. All kids should be learning that in school. Imagine how different America would be if, instead of sound bites and punditry, what we had was reasoned civil debate over the problems facing our nation. Climate change, inequality. These are big problems that we need to prepare our kids to address, and simply fighting with each other is not going to help us. The more energy we invest in fighting is the less energy we have for problem solving. I also think it's really important that, there's a lot of interest now in civics. Kids need to see how to apply what they're learning in their local communities, how to address civic issues, civic needs, so that because civics can't simply be about memorizing dates and facts from history. I was a social studies teacher, and I actually love American history. But what we really need is we want kids to be prepared as citizens who are intelligent voters, who understand why it's important to serve on a jury duty when they're called, who are active in their communities. And hopefully that's a part of civic education as well.
Should we strive to be nonpartisan in the way we teach in K-12 schools?
Absolutely. Education should be a nonpartisan issue. It shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter what state you're in or who the governor is. Our kids deserve, education is too important to allow it to be politicized. And so I strongly believe that education should be nonpartisan. We should treat education the way we treat our highways. Shouldn't matter who's the governor. We should want safety, quality to be the most important priorities.
So what strikes me about the book that you wrote with Rick is that the two of you at this stage in your careers, you're both deep into your careers, have the experience, have the deep knowledge of the research that allows you to take a principled stand and back that up. How do we help, young people, teachers coming into the classroom, those who are getting into education policy early in their careers, to be able to engage in those types of principled debates and move forward on an agenda?
So there are great resources out there. I think a book by Diana Hess on how to teach controversial topics. Edutopia has great resources for teachers on how to address controversy, because we don't want to tell our teachers, don't talk about anything controversial, because American history is loaded with controversy. We want them to do it in a way that's fair, that's balanced, that's reasoned, that's rooted in evidence. We want our kids to come out better prepared to grapple with these complex, difficult issues. So say, take someone like Thomas Jefferson. Here he is, the great American founding father who was also a slave owner. That should be, and quite possibly had children with one of his the people he owned. Rather than shun that issue, let's talk about it with students. Could he be both? Someone who was wrong as a slave owner, but right in terms of some of the ideas he articulated? I think kids are capable of handling that complexity, and we don't have to shield them from it.
I appreciate that. So on the topic of bias training, though, needed in schools, needed for many teachers, and at the same time in the book you say, I'm a little dubious, it can be done wrong. So what are your concerns right now? How would you proceed on that?
So I do believe bias training is needed. I believe bias and bigotry and racism are real. I haven't seen many districts approach it very well. I've been concerned because I've seen districts that invest a lot of money into bias training, and it actually has the opposite effect. It increases the polarization, the defensiveness. I think it has to be really focused on what a teacher does in the classroom each and every day with kids. How will it make me a better math teacher? How will it make me better able to form a relationship with a broad range of kids? All teachers, when they sign that contract to teach, sign a contract, they're going to teach all their students, not some of their students. And we want them to be prepared to work with kids who come from different cultures, different racial backgrounds, who speak different languages. And we don't want bias to get in the way. So you need to connect this bias training to the work that teachers do on a day-to-day basis in the classroom.
So you've talked about problems in education as complex problems, communities as actors in this. When it boils down to things, are there some common ingredients that you think exist in all good schools?
Absolutely. I think in all good schools, kids feel challenged. They feel they're not just going through the motions, they actually feel some degree of inspiration about what they're learning. Kids feel supported. They feel as though the adults who are there care about them and take an interest in them. And kids are encouraged to aspire, to aim high, to accomplish great things without being made anxious, without feeling as though if I don't get into the top school, I'm a failure. There's too much of that in the country. There's too many kids who are anxious because they're worried about which college they get into, or who are depressed because they got an A-. That, to me, is undermining education, and we need to do something about it.
Well, you deserve a lot of credit for, long ago elevating the issue of equity in public education. Talk to me about, during your career, like where are we now? Where are the bright spots? Where do you see real progress? And, where are you most worried?
So a few years ago, I wrote a book called Excellence Through Equity with Alan Blankstein, and we identified districts and schools around the country that were making progress in terms of equity. That is, disparities in achievement were closing, and achievement was rising for all kids. Very important. So it's excellence through equity. Today, I could write that book featuring more districts, because more districts are doing that work, and that, to me, is a sign that's encouraging. We did a study in Los Angeles on the state of Black children, and we documented some of the hardships that Black children were facing. But in that same report that we issued, we showed there was a high school in Watts, Martin Luther King Drew High School, which is attached to a medical school that sends more African-American students to the University of California each year than any school in Los Angeles. And why does it do it? It does it because it has an enriched learning environment, supports kids, they're getting a high-quality STEM education. My question is, why is there only one school like that in LA? Why aren't there a dozen schools like that? So we've been, I think, as a nation, focused on the wrong things. We've been focused on closing the gaps in achievement. What we should be focused on is expanding opportunities for kids. And I think if we did that, we would be in a much better place than we are now.
I appreciate that. I would love to ask you the question of just, what would be some of the recommendations you'd have for educators heading into this year? K-12 educators might be superintendents, might be principals, might be teachers. We're facing another uncertain and challenging year. What's your advice?
So I just tweeted about this today, about an article I read on Edutopia about the importance of building community, supporting our teachers and our students when they return. It would be a real mistake to launch right into, focusing on test preparation and ignore the fact that we've been through this traumatic experience. We have kids out there who've lost parents and grandparents. We need to acknowledge the difficulty that we've gone through, even as we move forward. So I'd encourage those of you listening out there to not see academic achievement as separate from the social and emotional needs of kids. They're all happening in the same person. And if we acknowledge the need for a more holistic approach to educating kids, I think that we'll be in a much better position.
All right, I'm going to close with a question on a topic that has been really prevalent here today in the conference. A lot of talk around broadband access, a lot of talk around the future of hybrid learning. How does that tie in with an equity agenda?
Well, we have a digital divide, which I'm sure was spoken about. We still have lots of people in rural and urban areas who don't have reliable access to the internet. So we've got to address that. But then we've got to make sure that online learning is high quality learning, that it's not simply kids doing worksheets that come through, from their teachers. So there are some, again, schools that have shown we can do high quality virtual learning, but we need to get the information out there because it's going to be part of education for years to come, and it should be. But we need to make sure that what's available really is good for kids and really does lead to deeper engagement and much greater interest in learning.
Well, Pedro, is there anything I left off the table that you wanted to say? This has been a great conversation, and you have, I'm done with my questions. Anything else you want to say to our audience of folks kind of across the education spectrum?
I can't think of anything. I don't know if there's if anybody wants to send a question in, but it's been great talking to you, Celine, and wish you the best.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having us, and have a great rest of the day, everyone.
You too.